All right, it looks like we're live. All right, guys. So, hey, I'm Chris Lee, SVP of Products here at Xactly. This is the second episode of Innovation Station, a show designed to bring revenue professionals together and to discuss best practices in aligning go-to-market teams and building impactful strategies to improve revenue performance. And today's topic is so top of mind, it's related to being strategic about all things incentive plan design. So I'm super lucky to have Marianne Kim, affectionately known as Mac, from Procore here with us today. So Mac, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you're going to bring a wealth of knowledge and information to this discussion. So why don't we start by you just providing a bit of background. I know that you've been in the incentive compensation management domain for quite some time. You have a very extensive background in the domain. Why don't you walk us through, the various different organizations that you worked at, the roles that you've held, and kind of what you've learned along the way.
Chris, how are you? Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is such a pleasure. So I have about, I think, give or take 25, 26 years of compensation plan background. And it varies between the administration execution, along with incentive design, and some strategic incentive and modeling, if you will, and analytics. And so, my experience ranges from like the large organizations such as Cisco level, through acquisitions. And then it runs all the way to very small organizations where I was part of a lot of different startups. One of the more successful startups, if you will, was LinkedIn. That was a fantastic place to work.
Right.
I was the first comp person there, and then eventually built out a team. By the time I left, it was about a 20-person organization, several thousand payees, and obviously multiple millions of dollars in commission costs. And then again, another very illustrative name is Salesforce. So I was there and got my chops as a senior analyst. We all start somewhere, and that was a fantastic place to be, especially during its heyday. Salesforce was a hot company, and even to this day, there's a lot of things that I learned from various places that was just very valuable to me today.
I love it. That's great background. So it seems like you've seen kind of the full gamut. Large organization, small organization, compensation practices that were just starting versus being more mature, throughout the past 25 or so years. Probably you've also seen, different things that have occurred within the economy and how that's influenced, the way folks approach compensation. So super excited for today. I've been looking forward to this discussion for the past couple of weeks. I appreciate you taking the time, Mac. I guess before we get into it, for the folks that have joined us today, there is a chat feature. We will be monitoring the chat, so feel free to type in questions, and we'll get to those questions throughout. And in the event that we don't have an opportunity to answer all the questions, we'll certainly follow up with folks afterwards. So encourage folks to type in questions to challenge Mac related to all things incentive plan design.
Please do.
All right, so for the first topic, I want to talk about trends, right? So naturally, a lot has changed as it relates to the topic of incentive plan design, right? And so again, given your tenure in this domain, why don't you kind of walk us through, from your perspective, how you believe like comp plan design has evolved, and where is it today versus where it's been, and why have things evolved the way that they have?
That is a fantastic question. Something I contemplate daily. All kidding aside, I would say that 26 years ago when I started, compensation was, I would say, a little bit of an afterthought. As the landscape of companies have evolved, and data has gotten very important, as well as there's micro and macroeconomic kind of pressures. A lot of leaders have since pivoted to being actually very involved in compensation as an organization, the department, as well as the core design work stream, along with the execution of it, if you will. And then following that, definitely the data and the kind of the story that it tells throughout a particular fiscal year, right, for the leaders, that helps inform them of how their organization is performing. Key and very important to all of us, as shareholders, if we're very lucky to be so, is the revenue that's being driven for the company, right? And that's obviously will align to what CFOs and CEOs want to report to the street. So it's very tightly aligned to that. And I would say the other thing, within the recent trends of like being profitable, compensation is not a small line item. It's definitely one of the bigger costs, if you will, of running a business. And the truth is, like, it's a needed cost, and it's well paid out if your organization's achieving its goals, right? And so if the sales organization is successful and winning, then obviously and hopefully the company itself is doing really well. So very, very important. I would say over the years, what I've seen is, as I mentioned, the trend to paying attention to compensation, and then finally really bringing it to the forefront. And it goes along and goes hand in hand with the corporate strategy, kind of the key objectives, and then it's translated into, each, organization's leaders kind of thought in terms of like getting their, corporate objectives, down to the nitty gritty of what their organization should achieve, right? Because then you have, the upper layer of like, hey, this is what the company wants to achieve. And then it gets dispersed to, for example, the chief, customer officer, they then translate to that, like, how can we, reduce churn and retain customers? And then, in terms of even, the CRO, obviously, how do you drive, new business and continue to expand and upsell? And so, I think there is definitely a lot more of a connection between some of the more loftier, like, strategic conversations to design and then, ultimately execution.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That sounds great. And I love how you anchored on this notion of data, right? Like, there's so much data that you've got to harness that data and leverage that data, right? And there is this notion of know your customers, know your, organizational strategy, but then there's also, what is everyone else doing, right? So how do you guys think about the use of benchmarking? I know that that's very prevalent in plan design, right? To complement what it is you can discern about your business and the opportunity that's available to you, and obviously how you're going to go and execute upon your strategy. But how do you kind of right size that, leveraging all of this external data that's available to make sure that, quite frankly, you're making the, right decisions about how to place your bets with your comp plan design?
Yeah, I would say that there's a couple of key areas where just, design and data is like very, very crucial and important. I mean, first of all, a lot of leaders are looking for a North Star, if you will. So they're always looking for, hey, what's the best practice out there? What has been working? What's already been proven out by other companies? And that is of some comfort to leadership, right? They want to see what's been working out there, especially if there is a peer company that is in its particular space and or company size and maturity. That's very helpful, right? They would much rather someone else make those mistakes, and maybe they can learn from those mistakes.
Yeah.
Right? Very few companies are that aggressive to kind of experiment, if you will, with their sales organization. There, you don't have that time or luxury, especially in the recent macroeconomic, conditions. So it is very helpful to kind of see that from benchmarking. What's definitely worked, what hasn't, and what can work, and would that fit our organization and our profile, right? So that's one. The second thing is benchmark perspective from just making key design changes. It is vitally important to make data-driven decisions. I mean, a lot of companies say, like, yeah, we want to make data-driven decisions. I'll be honest with you, at times there are a lot of folks where the data really has to kind of say a compelling, pointed trajectory of like, hey, this is where it's really the right way to go.
Mhm.
And that does give a lot of reassurance to, the finance leadership, to the sales leadership, and, all the other folks that are involved in design. So that is also very helpful. And then, I think the third thing would be when you narrow it down to the actual sales professional, regardless of whatever role you're in and what level you're at, key core thing that sales leaders, CROs really want to see is that, I want to know that my folks are making good money. Has that money earnings changed from a year over year perspective, and kind of eyes wide open, knowing what those decisions were, and how that's impactful to their sellers, because that's not only a recruiting tool, it's also kind of a great story. It's also part of like when they launch out the plan designs, and why we made certain decisions, and all the like the modeling and the data and the benchmarking all feed into that, so that um, you know the leaders that are making those decisions are very comfortable where they ended up. And that is a very very important tool to have. And if you're missing that, it's definitely um, you know hard for a leader to be able to make those tough decisions.
Right. Yeah, I love how you kept going back to this notion of decisions and using the data to be able to, help make the right decision. Love what you said as well about, organizations don't want to be the first to make a mistake. Let's, kind of leverage the mistakes that have been made in the past, right? And so speaking of like harnessing all of this data to improve decision making, I actually was going to go in a certain direction, but one of our attendees just posted a question that I guess I'll post right now. And they're asking about generative AI, right? So naturally, folks are thinking about how do I leverage the power of generative AI? So how do you see kind of this notion of generative AI incentive plan design kind of intersecting with one another? How are organizations, if you look into your crystal ball, how are organizations going to be using generative AI to just make better decisions about ultimately what they do about incentive plan design?
Yeah, I'd say AI is a hot topic, right? That is the forefront of everyone who is anyone is talking about it. Um, I mean, what was follow on is the generative AI from predictive AI, right? So I think if, and again, I'm no expert, but if you recall, predictive AI was definitely taking the data and really predicting, certain outcomes, et cetera, if you will, right? And so that was like one really great step. And then moving beyond that, generative AI is even more amazing because it's kind of like the future is here. It's one of those things where hopefully with generative AI, you can see a lot of efficiencies, right? Among which will hopefully not only just take away, like, obviously, kind of like the mundane tasks, but, from a data perspective, they can actually, it can actually provide solutions, right? For, certain questions to have, great answers for those questions, which is then, driven by that, data driven generative kind of workflow. The whole data exploration, the kind of the wide expanse of like what data you have. It's going to be really important to make sure, and I think this has been always the case, is how well your data is coming through, and what you can take from that. But apart from that, generative AI is really taking it one step further. And so hopefully it can gather from many more, not just your own data sets, but, it's obviously pulling from many more other sources, which, I think will be fantastic, come, the road mapping for Xactly, and, what they're innovating on that level.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And you kind of touched on this notion of like the cleanliness of the data. As we do talk to customers, that seems to be the biggest concern right now, right? Is my data clean such that I can then subject it to generative AI to help me make decisions? But at the end of the day, it does seem like in some form or fashion, generative AI will be the tool with which you feed it a bunch of data, and then you say, hey, go ahead and synthesize all of that for me and prescribe to me what should I do from a plan design standpoint, right? It'll be able to curate all of that data, find the patterns, find the area for opportunity, and say, hey, here's an initial cut at what I think you should, focus on. And then obviously the organizations will bring, their leaders into the fold, and they can take that starting point and make it their own based on, kind of their human judgment that they can use to amplify what the generative AI can tell them. Okay, so I'm going to move on a little bit. So you touched a little bit on like the current macro environment that we're in. And so obviously right now, organizations are being rewarded to balance, profit with growth. You can't lose sight of one, but you need to focus on both. How are you finding organizations are trying to strike that balance to ensure that, naturally they need to grow, but they need to grow in a profitable way? Are there certain techniques that organizations are employing to make sure that they strike that balance? How are you seeing that play out given the current macro environment?
Yeah, I would say some things don't change, if you will. Really astute finance leaders have always driven profitability or
Right.
um, not being frugal, but actually being very responsible or strategic in their spending. That's how I would preface it. The one thing, CROs and sales leaders, obviously, they don't want to hear that, we're looking to cut their team's earnings. If at all that can be helped, right? And so their baseline is how much can we, pay the organization and keep it that way, right? Because not only will that attract like the best talent, but it's going to keep the sales organization really hungry and motivated, and that is one of the key things that design has to fulfill. Um, now, with that being said, you certainly don't want to have a plan where you're nickel and diming your best top performers.
Right.
That's definitely a way to drive away really key top performers. They'll go somewhere else where they can make maybe double or triple or quadruple, if you will. And so I've designed and been part of organizations where it was extremely frugal down up to actually very generous. And I'll tell you that what ends up working is um you always do want to strike the right balance. And as folks say, like, what's the right balance? Because you can say that and it's like, oh, are you strike the right balance?
Right.
But what is that for the company you're at, the organization that you're in, right? At different stages and junctures, your company may not be ready to be profitable this year, but maybe they're going to drive towards it next year, right? And so you plan ahead, and it's like a multi-year step if you're really good at not only your job but also working with a really very excellent like finance team. So I would say that striking that right balance means, for example, um, when you're designing, are you trying to solve for ensuring that the bulk of your organization is going to make their targets?
Right.
Are you going to, or are you a performance organization? You're like, actually, if you're in the bottom 50%, we're okay that you're not making as much money as the top 10, 20%. That those are all, I think philosophical questions you have to answer to kind of get to the point where you're going to strike that right balance. I would say that it definitely feeds from there. And then ultimately there are a lot of ways you can, if you will, shave off and get towards profitability and actually have savings without the sales organization really feeling it, right? Without them feeling like, look, I once lived in Beverly Hills and now I moved out of that neighborhood and I'm having to scrimp pennies, right, if you will.
Right.
So
Yep.
yeah, so I would say that there's different ways to do that, and again, that it goes all the way back to the data and kind of modeling and looking to see um, what questions you want answered. Like how much of our organization do we want to pay at the the top percentile? Can is that affordability there? Because you certainly can get to profitability and still continue to pay your the behaviors that you need. And and some of it's a little bit of a puts and takes, like
Yep.
you have to be strategic about where the decisions are. And so again, it does go back to not only the data and like what your organization is kind of showing from like the behavior and the kind of the results, if you will. The stories there, you really definitely have to kind of look for it and tease it out. And then certainly then you can make those decisions on where you can kind of aim, your dollars more versus, less, in certain places.
Right. So I heard you use the word decisions a number of times, and it does seem like, incentive plan design, it's an art more than it is a science. Naturally, you leverage the data to try and inform your decisions, but at the end of the day, it comes down to decisions. When I think about decisions, I think about collaboration. So from your perspective, like if you could wave a magic wand, what is like the ideal work structure in order to like best support the process that is incentive plan design? What roles should be involved, and who should be the gatekeeper, and how do they work with the different cross-functional teams? Like, what does good look like from an org design standpoint in order to be effective at incentive plan design?
That is like one of the key questions every compensation professional and leader should ask themselves
Right.
before they start the design work stream and planning process. Hopefully, you're starting your planning 6 months to 4 months ahead.
Okay.
Namely because you want to make sure that when you start off the work stream that you're not only have enough time to make those design decisions, but then also in execution system part, there's enough time for your system admin or your IT organization or your consultant to be able to actually execute and test in UAT and actually execute the new configuration, depending on how wide your, changes could be.
Right.
I would say, so back to your question, the first thing you really want to do is establish a RACI, a decision matrix, if you will. Who is part of that committee. What really looks great is that you launch out with that so that folks understand, like, hey, these are the decision makers. That's the D. You're an input. You get to socialize and input your feedback into this process. But ultimately, sometimes there are folks who think they're the D and they're not the D.
Right. Right.
And then there's E for execution, right? And then, there's obviously clearly people that need to execute on the decisions that are made. And so I would say establishing that, and what looks really great is that folks really understanding their role and really contributing in that way is what looks good. And then what looks great is actually a really, cooperative, if you will, cooperative business partner and team, firing on all, I call it firing on all, cylinders. And, ultimately, because design is such a joint effort, if you will, it's never a single person. It's definitely, key folks that are all part of the process. So what looks great is having involvement all the way from your corporate strategic, VP or leader, telling you this is our corporate objectives for next year, as they tell the entire, company. And then, translating that into design, which is where, the design, person will actually take that into account. And then providing, a space for feedback, like actual real feedback from leadership, the
Right.
actual sales leadership, folks who, the boots on the street, if you will, like folks who actually are saying, look, you may have, this may be the objective, but, for example, the product isn't ready in Singapore, for example, or it's not ready for France because, there's some key challenges there, right? And so some of those nuances do have to be taken into account with the design. You can't just blanket one size fits all. You can definitely drive towards some consistency, obviously, in a global view of design, but it would be a mistake to ignore some of those challenges or friction point, if you will. And so, that definitely is a good part to bring into that in terms of like, the total decision matrix and tree. And then, providing that feedback to the leaders and, the corporate strat guys and gals, it is very helpful, right? Because it makes them think about, if they're not already getting that feedback, it helps them with the input and how, they can, potentially tweak, right? Potentially tweak like what their thought process was. And so that's all part of the design workflow. And then, obviously our near and dear buddies, sales operations, field operations, you name it, those folks are very key to a successful compensation plan and execution. They are vitally important to the process in general. And then I would say, obviously, finance is a big key driver. They are the folks who hold the purse strings.
Right.
They're the ones who tell you, hey, this is how much headcount that's going to be deployed, for this year. And so, their confirmation of what the cost envelope, the total budget is obviously very key, and certainly there has to be a strong partnership there in driving towards like the revenue goals, right? And so I would say those are the main. And then from a people person, you definitely make sure legal and HR are part of that, to make sure that the company is not at risk, if you will, and obviously treating employees fairly. So I would say those are the main key folks. And then, IT and systems, they come in and out. And obviously they're obviously a very, very important part of the whole process as well.
Got it. So nearly every department in New York, basically. This is highly cross-functional, right? So actually another question just came in, Mac. You used the term execution a few times in this kind of notion of, making sure that there's enough, time between when the designs are finalized and giving the execution team, the ability to then go and operationalize the plans themselves. So the question is all about kind of this difference between plan design and plan administration. Can you just talk a little bit about the difference? It sounds like, based on talking to customers, sometimes there is this, confusion as to, are these things the same, or, is there a clear delineation between like what is incentive plan design and incentive plan administration?
Yeah, that's a great question. And smaller companies will definitely have those two disciplines in one department. As you get larger, in certain companies, they sometimes split those apart, if you will. But ultimately, what comp plan design is, and how I would describe it is, it is the function and organization that takes the corporate strategic objectives, translates it into driving, and incenting behaviors from the sales organization, and anyone that's on a comp plan, to help meet those objectives. And so you design, however you will, to kind of juice up certain, you pay more for certain revenue streams, if you will, versus others, because you're really saying like, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Salesperson, this is really important to us. We want you to go sell more of that. We would like you to, drive more of this, with the customer. That is how I would describe design. And part of that is definitely, could be potentially a little bit ivory tower-ish, but then where the rubber hits the road is the administration and system part of it, where they then take what those design elements were, and then they translate it into how it's actually going to be paid, from a system configuration perspective. And then that's where it translates to a check into the, or a wire transfer into the sales individual, their hands, right? And so those things are very connected.
Of course.
If you're a person with design and you don't happen to have system experience, try to go out and expose yourself and get that, because there can be a lot of interpretation done from a design perspective to an administration and system configuration perspective. I've seen some friends who've designed things and then how it intended, and then the way it got translated into a system, and how the rules were written were totally different than what they expected.
Right. Not surprised. Okay, so to kind of net it out, incentive plan design, all about, we've got these corporate objectives, here's our corporate strategy. What do we think the mechanics of the plan should be to incent the right behaviors to go ahead and actually execute upon that strategy and hit our goals? And then incentive plan administration is more so, we've made the decisions about the mechanics. Now let's go and actually operationalize, execute the go-to-market motion, and then go ahead and pay folks for the performance that they brought to the organization. So kind of decision making, go and sell, and then pay folks from an administration standpoint. So, going back to this notion of like trying to figure out like what are the right mechanics of these plans to support the corporate strategy. So obviously there's multiple elements that are in play, not just incentive design in order to execute upon the corporate strategy. So can you talk us through where does incentive design fit within kind of the broader go-to-market strategy and sales planning exercise? So like where do territory planning and quota planning exercises fit into, incentive design? How do these things kind of interrelate with one another?
So I've definitely been more of a collaborative, design compensation professional. You can definitely make sure that there's a lot of cooperation, if you will, and transparency among all the teams. That's when it's best done. So the way that comp fits and how I see it is, even though it could potentially be seen from an execution perspective towards the end, from a design perspective, it's at the very, very forefront with corporate strategy. And definitely, I would say Procore does a really good job of making sure that, the strategic initiatives and, when those things are being, locked with the leadership at the C level, it's close to near when it's being locked and then landed when it's when folks brought in myself and obviously our compensation team. It's a fantastic way to really have a strong partnership and not lose the corporate strategy and objectives and like kind of the goals for like the following year, and really making sure that that's translated into what the plan is going to drive. And so I would say this is probably one of the top 5 places that I've been at where it's been a very close alignment. So that's where comp would fit in at the very beginning, and then towards the execution towards the end. But then all in the middle is really kind of finances, planning. It's a little bit in parallel where they plan, obviously, here's a top line goal, here's the head count, here is the folks that you need to make this happen. Here's the resourcing, here are the ratios between SDRs and AEs, right? Like, here's like how, here's how that will be supported. And then that translates into the middle part there, that translates with, working with sales or field operations, where they are taking the headcount and planning and translating that to how they carve up the territory and the coverage. And so you see that there's a direct correlation between, finance and field operations, at least at the best places. That's how there should be, kind of a tight correlation. So without knowing that headcount, the territory folks can't carve up the territories. They need to know what that finite number is and what that final number is to be able to carve that out. If you have 20 people and you carve for 30 territories, it's, that's not going to work, right? You're going to have a gap in coverage. So again, vitally important. And then how does that fit into compensation? Then, the territory and the quotas should be tightly aligned, right? The opportunity of what the territories will yield should translate into not only the productivity of the reps, but the quota size. And so, again, that's another stop where finance and then compensation and field operations all work hand in hand to make sure that there is, transparency, and that, we're aware of how the territories were set up and how the quotas were, made up. Because at the end of the day, that goes into the cost, the overall cost of commissions.
Right.
And what you can forecast. If there is a disconnect there, you can sometimes definitely see abnormal commission expense, go up because, for example, Chris, I gave you a quota of like 1.3 million, but I gave you a territory that probably could yield 3 times that size.
Right.
And then somebody asks me like, well, why are your commission costs so expensive? And it's like, well, there's something broken there, right? And so that is why commissions is a little bit a part of every little process in the middle, at the start, and the beginning. So that's how I see it, as very crucial in different flavors.
Got it. So basically everything just needs to stay in unison. Otherwise, there can be the kind of the weakest link kind of situation there. All right. So Mac, so we're running out of time. Last question is, how do you ensure that the comp plan that you designed is actually yielding the result that you originally intended it to yield? What do you do to make sure that the comp plan is doing what it was supposed to do?
How do you ensure that? This is a fantastic question, right? How do you like make sure? Like, is it you're saying like, look, how do you guarantee? I almost hear like, how do you guarantee or make sure that what you intended is resulting in kind of the results that you might be aiming for. So I would say, barring all those things firing on all cylinders, as I mentioned, which is, let's say your territory is great, your quotas were set fine,
Right.
or well, and the planning and folks were all working together. How do you ensure that? Then it goes back to, again, kind of the looking at the data and making sure you're on top of the analysis, whether it's on a monthly or a quarterly basis. Having some sort of reporting package out that really shows the story of how what the trend is and how things have been progressing to the original goals that the organization had. You kind of like, hey, this is what we wanted to achieve, like X amount of new logos, or this amount of customer acquisition, or this amount of expansion, right? And then you look to see, like, and then are we getting towards like profitability? Is there anything weird happening from a cost perspective? That's really easy to do if you have the data and you can take a look at it from a monthly or quarterly basis to say, like, look, we did a histogram, or we did some sort of an attainment layer over earnings attainment, right? So you basically say, like, look, Chris, your organization's at like 60% of the organization is trending nicely towards their goals, their quotas and goals, and then the earnings are about where you would have expected it to be. If there's any pops there, there has to be a good reason for it, right? Either somebody just really killed their number, or if you're seeing like some weird like anomaly of, again, folks earning more, and let's say the revenue's not there for the company,
Right.
then that's usually a very easy sign that quotas probably weren't set well, if you will, or something's off. Yeah. So definitely those are the canary in the mine, if you will. Like, those are some really good early indicators. And then
Right.
you can obviously analyze even from cutting and slicing the data from like different perspective, like even getting more granular to like, hey, look, how is my new business trending from my base renewal? Has churn gone up? Like those things all matter from not only corporate perspective but also from a comp perspective, because they do drive the pay. And then that goes and ties back into what you assumed your design of what your plan was going to do based on how you designed it. So I would say that that's like one like quick and dirty way to think about it. But definitely keep looking at things.
Okay, so I guess the key takeaway is, you could have the best intentions with the plan design, right? You did all of this data analysis and collaboration across the org, but then when you operationalize those plans, things can happen where, the result deviates from the intended outcome, and it just comes down to analyze, and then course correct, if that's required. So Matt, really, really appreciate your time. We're actually out of time at this point, so we're going to need to wrap up. There's actually a couple of additional questions that came through. We're not going to have time to answer them, so we'll take them offline and we'll reach out to folks with the appropriate responses. Again, Mac, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure. Always learn so much when we chat. So thank you so much for your time.
Chris, thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Thanks again.
Otherwise, take care, guys. Bye-bye.